And welcome to Game. I'm Dan. How are you doing today?
That was ridiculous. Hey, everybody. Welcome to your midweek edition. We're back. It is the Gamehuggers podcast. We are live here on youtube.com. So check us out. We've got a very fun episode. Shit. We've got a fun planned episode this week of 16-bit RPGs. We're going to go through an entire list of 16 of our top favorite RPGs with our panel of experts, expert RPG players, and we're going to find out what exactly is the greatest RPG of all time during the 16-bit era. And when I mean RPGs, I am talking about RPGs, role-playing game, traditional turn-based role-playing games. So I'm not talking about action RPGs. I'm not talking about point-and-click adventure games. This is strictly for your turn-based role-playing games. For example, games like Dungeons & Dragons, Warriors of the Eternal Sun, or Ultima, The False Prophet. Neither of those games made our list this year, but those are a couple types of games. Or Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, those types of games. Not Secret of Mana, not Zelda, not Ys. So
it's worth noting that Shining Force 2 made the list, which is a strategy-style RPG.
Shining Force 2, yes, that is true. And that kind of squeaked in, but oh, what the heck. We could have put in Military Madness then too, couldn't we?
Or Hell of Fire Emblem.
But
There's quite a few Fire Emblem games, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so let's meet our panel of brilliant role-playing game experts. Let's start off with Dan. How you doing, Dan?
I'm upset that Lufia is on the list.
You're upset that Lufia... Okay, that's fine. Meng, how are you, sir? Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, nice to be back. Doing okay.
And Tony, what's new, guy?
Not much. Playing way too many video games, not having enough time to finish. And yes, there is a new Yakuza, so it's taken over my life.
Yeah, how is that? Do you like that one?
Oh, I could talk about it for hours.
Really?
But let's stick to the topic at hand. But yes, you should play it.
All right. Well, I've always wanted to play one of those Yakuza games. They seemed like a lot of fun. They had a lot of similarities to Shenmue, so I really piqued my interest.
Well, for those who are interested in picking up those games, Sega actually reprinted a bunch of them because they were doing so well.
Now, they reprinted the PS2 games?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can
Why?
actually go on Amazon and pick them up right now because apparently people are now starting to notice it for the first time.
But why
Kind of
not
that
re-release them like in digital format for like the PS4 or re-release them in physical form in like a collector's edition for the PS4 or something?
Well, just so I don't...
They might do that, but they make more discs.
Well, I was going to say, just so you don't, or I don't sidetrack the whole thing, I'll just say, if you haven't played the first one and you have a PS4, wait till the summer.
Ah, okay. Anyway, yes, I agree. We should move on. We've got a lot of games to talk about tonight. We'll go through our bracket. Now, this is a bracket that was made up of guys and gals that basically commented on our Facebook chats, Facebook threads, as well as emailed me messages through private message and through email on what games they wanted included. So we've got dozens and dozens of games that were sent to me to throw on here. And basically what I did is I went via whatever games got the most votes, got the highest seeds. So when I go through this list, I'll go through the whole list to start off. I'll show you what games made what made our bracket. And if you see, there's a graphic as well on our Facebook page, facebook.com/gamehuggers. You can see the actual graphic of the bracket that we have. But I wrote this one here on a little whiteboard, really easy tonight. I know it's not exactly what is our budget, Dan? What are we at now? Like $4.12, I think, or something.
It's not that high.
It's not even that high. So rather than having a really groovy graphic up right now, I'm just going to write it on this whiteboard because this will make it easier for me. But here, let's go through our list. In the number 1 seed, we have Chrono Trigger. That got the most votes on our... Let me bring this up real quick here so I can see another image of it. Because I have what spots they're all in. Spots.
So Lufia is number 8 because it's against Chrono Trigger.
Technically, it's 16. And our 16th spot was Lufia. a Super Nintendo RPG made by Taito, right?
Yep.
Was it produced or produced by Taito and actually developed by somebody else? Then in our 9th seed is Dragon Quest V, the Super Famicom version that was recently brought to the US on Nintendo DS and other formats.
It's Android.
And Android, and it was also fan translated for Super Nintendo, so you can find
PS2.
And PS2. In the 8th seed is Phantasy Star 2. So right there we have an 8th and 9th seed matchup. Phantasy Star 4 was our 4th seed, chosen by the people that voted and suggested ideas. Might and Magic 3 is our 13th spot. So Might and Magic 3 and Phantasy Star 4 in the first round. That's kind of an interesting matchup of two entirely different games. Then we have Lunar 2, Eternal Blue for the Sega CD. In our 12th spot, Earthbound is coming at us at the 5th seed for the Super Nintendo. Obviously, if you don't know what Earthbound is, you're missing out quite a bit. Final Fantasy 3 was our 2nd seed. So Chrono Trigger was number 1, Final Fantasy 3, or Final Fantasy 6 for those that who were first introduced to Final Fantasy with Final Fantasy 7.
So this is 6.
Yes, it's 6. The only ones that came out in the US on the Super Nintendo were 4 and 6, which
And Mystical Quest.
Oh, and Mystical Quest. Sure, Mystical Quest. And then in the 15th seed, unlucky number 15, got War Song or Langrisser for the Sega and also for the PC Engine CD. So if you've got experience playing those games, you know they're a lot of fun.
It also came out on Super Famicom.
Yep. Oh, did it really? Oh, yeah, that's right. Langrisser, yeah. Then we have our number 10th seed, which is Far East of Eden 2.
Manji Maru.
Manji Maru, yeah. That's a Japanese-only game, and it was also re-released for the PS2 as well.
And DS and GameCube.
All right.
And
Well, I didn't even know that. That one's going up against Super Mario RPG, which is our 7th seed. Lunar, the Silver Star Story.
Yeah, you got that wrong. It's actually The Silver Star. Silver Star Story is the remake.
Oh, sorry. The Silver Star. For the Sega CD, the original Lunar is in our 3rd seed, and it's going up against a TurboGrafx CD, TurboGrafx Super CD RPG, made by Falcom with excellent soundtrack, called Dragon Slayer, or Legend of Heroes.
The Legend of Heroes, yes.
Then we have the only strategy RPG on our list that kind of squeaked in, Shining Force 2.
War Song is there too.
War Song, okay, fine. Shining Force 2, which is, of course, an awesome Genesis game, which is going up against Final Fantasy 2, or Final Fantasy 4 in Japan. So we've got the whole bracket right here, and we're going to start off right at the top with our first challenge. It's Chrono Trigger going up against Lufia. So now, before we jump into our votes right away and say, my vote's for whatever, my vote's for that, let's each make one quick statement saying why they think this game's better than the other one, or vice versa, and then we'll go through and maybe we can, some of these are probably really easy picks. Like maybe our first one is an easy pick. I don't know. But we should at least give them a couple minutes to kind of give some kind of an argument, right? For every one of these games. So, Tony, you want to start us off? Chrono Trigger versus Lufia. What are your thoughts?
Now, obvious answer for me, but I'm going to go Chrono Trigger. Main reason why is Lufia is kind of a type of game that I didn't really get into the first one. I was more into the second one with puzzles and a little more developed of a story, where Chrono Trigger kind of hit all those beats at the same time.
All right, Meng, what are your thoughts?
Well, so far for me, it's Chrono Trigger, because I haven't played Lufia at all that much. I've seen some screenshots of it, but as far as I can tell, I think Chrono Trigger, to me, was a lot better, only because of the multiple different endings and the gameplay style of the battle system.
So okay, now before Dan goes, because I'm sure he's not going to say anything positive, I'm going to talk about Lufia a little bit. It's not that Lufia is a better game. I'll be honest here. Chrono Trigger is a tough game to top. But Lufia has a very interesting opening that you didn't see very often back in the day on the Super Nintendo. Mid-1993, I think, is when it came out. And it had a really unique idea where they basically gave you the prologue, the prelude, chapter to open it up, where you saw the character that was the father of the main character from Lufia 1, and you actually got to play through the dungeon, going through and beating the boss of the game, and then this huge earthquake happened, the building started falling down, and it was a really interesting opening to the game that I thought was very unique at the time, where you got to play as these characters who were obviously super high in level, and it kind of gave you an opportunity to play and learn the gameplay style when you're pretty much invincible, to try to play through that. And then you see this big intro to the game, whereas a lot of times in games like Utopia or you know, Secret of Mana, or what, you know, all these other games where you just kind of wake up in bed and someone tells you, like, your father was a great warrior, you're his son, you got to continue in his footsteps. You actually like saw it and you got to play through it, and I thought that was a really cool concept.
No wonder why I thought that was kind of funny when I tried the intro for the first time. I was like, these are the end bosses, right? I was like, why was it that I'm beating them so hardly without even trying?
Well, the first time I played Lufia, I actually rented it, and I thought that I had accidentally continued somebody else's save. Anyway,
Yeah,
Dan,
that's what I thought.
what are your thoughts on Lufia versus Chrono Trigger?
So here's the big thing. Chrono Trigger is a fantastic game that has great settings, great characters, fantastic music. It plays extremely well. It was designed around a lot of the irritations players have had with Japanese RPGs. Things like being able to avoid random encounters. Things like too complicated of puzzles. Things like not being able to get out of conversations with townspeople. You just walk away. Lufia is a piece of garbage. And Lufia is a very lazy Japanese RPG that is worse than, say, Tecmo's Secret of the Stars.
Whoa!
The reason that people like Lufia is the second game is better than the first one, but it's not so good. So, I mean, this is an open and shut case to me. Lufia has very little positives except for the fact that it has a couple of sequels, and Chrono Trigger is a masterpiece. My vote goes for Chrono Trigger.
Oh, and I want to mention here, too, our good friend Ryan. Ryan is back on the show this week. Hi, Ryan. How you doing? Can you hear me, Ryan? He looks like he's frozen.
It looks like a different Disney movie.
Yep. Look on this face.
No, he must not. He must have glitched out. So we have this like inside joke. Whenever Ryan decides to join our podcast, his computer blue screens almost every single time he's on the show. So my guess is he got on, and hey, look at that, he just disappeared. My guess is he actually blue screened while he was trying to say hi. Sad, but that sucks. See you, Ryan. Maybe you'll be back on another time, maybe today even. Anyway, so okay, I will write down the winner of that matchup. I'll give it to Lufia, right? I'm just kidding. I'll give it to.
I think if we do that, Dan will riot.
The games are bad. I also forgot that. Have you played the third Lufia game?
I didn't even know there was one. Was that a GBA game or something?
Yeah, it's Game Boy Color. I was actually just digging through my shelf because I almost forgot this fucking thing exists.
Is it not good?
No, it's not. It's a Lufia game. Why are you even asking that question?
Wow. Okay. All right. So our second matchup in round 2 is Dragon Quest V versus Phantasy Star 2. So we've got a Super Nintendo or Super Famicom versus Sega Genesis matchup. I will start it off. I personally do not have a very broad experience with Dragon Quest V. Actually, matter of fact, I've really never even played it. I haven't played it on any of the different ports of it. I just recently started a game on the Super Famicom on an emulator just to test it out before the show. Seems very cool. It's really neat. But, you know, Phantasy Star 2, when that came out, I mean, a lot of game magazines gave it awards for Game of the Year, Role-Playing Game of the Year, and it actually topped Eastbook 1 and 2 and EGM's Best Role-Playing Game of the Year, which I was really pissed about at the time. That game is pretty amazing. I mean, it basically takes everything that was cool about Phantasy Star on the Master System and upped it into better graphics, better music, really awesome gameplay. I loved the game a lot. I think it's got a fantastic soundtrack. So my vote for this round goes to Phantasy Star 2.
So I'm going to jump in real quick and talk about Phantasy Star 2. It did not improve on Phantasy Star 1.
Sure
it didn't have the cool-looking dungeons. It didn't have backgrounds that matched the environment. The battle system while basically the same, had a lot higher encounter rates, and there was a big balance problem, so you spent way more time grinding. I don't think that the story was intriguing. It certainly didn't innovate in the same way. It simply happened to be the first English-released traditional Japanese RPG on a 16-bit console. And that's its mark of uniqueness.
Did it
I
come
don't
out
actually
before
think
Super Hydroid?
we're saying traditional Japanese RPG here.
All right.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Dragon Quest V. Dragon Quest V is a game that, kind of like you mentioned with Lufia, you start off kind of before the main timeline of the game with your father and whatnot in your party, and you go on a little bit of an adventure. I think the key thing that really makes this game unique, both for a Dragon Quest game and for a Japanese RPG in general, is it is a game that was intentionally designed with, okay, we expect the people who are playing Dragon Quest V have played other Japanese RPGs. So we're going to take every traditional trope that you expect in a Japanese RPG, and we're going to do the exact opposite. So you walk around just like, oh, I hear there's a legendary hero who may be coming through town. There's this armor, and if the legendary hero walks up to it, I'm sure it'll fit him perfectly. And you're probably thinking, oh, that must be my character. But maybe it's not. And those kind of little things, along with the direction the story goes, absolutely throws you for a loop. And the Dragon Quest games are very similar to Chrono Trigger in the sense that they're built around having really interesting, fun scenarios as you go from town to town and place to place. This game has that, but it also has a very interesting and epic overlying story, which is not necessarily the case with most of the games in the series. That, combined with rock-solid gameplay and tight mechanics, make Dragon Quest V the easy winner here over a kind of sloppy, messy, early 16-bit RPG in Phantasy Star 2.
Sold! Because I have no input on this.
Wait. What? Meng, what is your pick?
I think you just went to Dragon Quest.
You son of a bitch. All right, Tony.
I'm also going to join the Dragon Quest, but for another simpler reason. Here's the simple reason. I prefer Phantasy Star 4 over 2. That's my thing.
Okay.
So throwing Dragon Quest V in there makes this a bit more of an interesting pick for me, especially because you had just come off of Dragon Quest 4 at the time, which had multiple protagonists, and you got to do different chapters throughout.
I love Dragon Warrior 4. That's a great game.
That's one of the things I like with the Dragon Quest series is it's technically the same thing over and over. I mean, the same gameplay of grind, kill monster, go into town, grind, fight boss, grind, lather, rinse, repeat. But they've always found a way to shake it up in some unique fashion. Because, I mean, I play these maybe about an hour, and then I have to put it down because various reasons. But each time I do, there's something unique about each one. Okay. So, and unfortunately, since we can't give it to 4, I'll at least give 5 some love in this one.
All right. Then Dragon Quest V defeats Phantasy Star 2. That moves on to Might and Magic 3 and Phantasy Star 4. I can tell you what, these games are very dissimilar games. They're not at all identical. They're very different games. Matter of fact, I think Might and Magic 3 might be the only first-person view RPG that made our list, which is kind of shocking because there were a lot of games that came out in that era that are similar to Might and Magic 3, like Wizardry, Eye of the Beholder, Order of the Griffin, Dungeon Master. Anyway, Might and Magic 3 is a lot of fun. I think it's a great game, but the biggest pisser about it, especially on the Turbo Duo version, is that it takes up an entire, the entire backup RAM of your save. You literally have to delete everything off of your system before you can play Might and Magic 3. It won't even let you get past the intro screen. So you have to delete all of your saves, and then you can play through Might and Magic 3. That's annoying as all hell. The Super Nintendo version, obviously, it has its own battery backup on it, so that it's a pretty good game. But Phantasy Star 4 is probably one of the best games on this list, and I think it's going to be tough to beat. So my vote there is Phantasy Star 4.
I'm going to join that too. I haven't played Might and Magic 3, but I have this thing about like the Eye of the Beholder style early dungeon crawler games, in that I don't like them.
Really? Oh, man.
I just have so many problems with the mechanics of it. Like later games like Legend of Grimrock started to really make those worth my time. But what I like about Phantasy Star 4, there's not too many like sci-fi games out there.
Okay.
So, or especially from a JRPG stance. I mean, yeah, Chrono Trigger has some sci-fi elements, but pure on.
You would have
future
loved Phantasy Star 2.
Right, but the thing was 4 had that chance to refine it in a way. Plus,
It did.
having
It was a much
the
better
things
game.
like the macro system where I can just punch a button and run some commands for me kind of does help, especially with some of the grindiness, because, hey, I hit one button and I walk away.
Yeah.
So having little touches like that, and plus, hey, let's give the Genesis some love in this category, because holy cow, there's only 3 games on here. I think there's actually more TurboGrafx games than there are Genesis games.
Well, no, I mean, some of these are on multiple systems as well. And not to forget the Sega CDs as well. Lunar 1 and 2 are both on here. So. All right, Meng, what are your thoughts on Phantasy Star 4 versus Might and Magic 3?
So far, I haven't played either one of these two. I might have played them when I was surfing through them, but probably don't remember any of them.
Well, then you're not an expert on the topic. What the hell?
That's why we have air quotes for the show.
All right, Dan.
So I'm going to go with the sentiment here and go with Phantasy Star 4. A few things about Phantasy Star 4 compared to 2, as we were just discussing. Isn't quite as much grinding. The art is better. The pacing of the game itself is better. It closes out the Phantasy Star saga. I know there's online games and whatnot made later, but it closes out the main, I'll say 3 games because Phantasy Star 3 is a piece of garbage, but it closes out the main saga of Phantasy Star and is the best traditional RPG on the Genesis, leaving, what is that? What's the homebrew game? Watermelon.
Pure Solar.
Pure Solar.
Leaving Pure Solar possibly out of the equation. There's also Beggar Prince as well. So Phantasy Star 2 is my easy vote.
All right. So you would think that Phantasy Star 2 is better than Phantasy Star 3?
No, I'm sorry. Yes, 2 is better than 3. 4 is better than 2.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So then on the left side of the bracket, our last matchup is going to be Earthbound for the Super NES versus Lunar Eternal Blue on the Sega CD. What are your thoughts on that one, Meng?
So far, I haven't played the Sega CD one. I know you tell me that it's the one of the definitive versions on Sega CD and not on the PlayStation.
Well, if you've had experience with the PlayStation 1, you played it. I mean, it's not the perfect version, but it still works. It's a fine game.
They both have flaws. If you don't mind, I'm going to go into the differences between the 2 versions of the game without doing any plot spoilers or anything else, along with some other just kind of notes on it. So I think the key thing about Lunar 2 that makes it a really unique game is the fact that the production values, the amount of animated sequences, the amount of voice acting, and the sheer scale and scope of this game is as large as you'll find on any English-released Japanese RPG of that era. You have tons of cutscenes. You have a large amount of animation. You have a large amount of voice acting. You have some fantastic, not just pixel art, but art you'll find throughout the game. The music is great. Now, as far as the differences between the PlayStation and Sega CD version, there is no one version that's necessarily superior. The Sega CD version has enormous dungeons, and I'm trying to describe this as best as possible. The kinds of dungeons that you either needed to buy the strategy guide for or make your own maps to find your way back to where you were going. On the downside, your characters kind of move slowly over the overworld map, and there is a high encounter rate. So there are some irritations in this game that are removed from the PlayStation version, or the Saturn version if you played that. The downside is the Saturn and PlayStation versions have what I would call dungeons for idiots. And besides the fact that you can avoid enemies on the map, and there's even a little dash to go around them, the dungeons are incredibly linear and straightforward. It's impossible to get lost there. There's no challenge to navigating your way through a dungeon of things. You can pick and choose when to fight, and the entire exploration, and this is the case with both Lunar remakes on the PlayStation and Saturn, the entire exploration is gone from those games. So the original Sega CD version, you have a lot more exploration. There's some plot points that were removed from the remake. I'd say the Sega CD version is the more complete version of the game, but it's also a little bit more irritating. Now, to touch on Earthbound a little bit, Earthbound is a really fun, cute game that I understand why people like it as much as they do. It's a game that has a great amount of charm. It has humor, it has funny battles, and it takes place in a not so traditional fantasy world where it's like, 1950s America and a UFO has landed and you're, trying to avoid child molesters and other things you find in town. I mean, by the way, that is an actual thing in the game. They just kind of renamed it or went around it. So there's certainly a lot of charm to it. My vote is going to go to Lunar 2 because it is just so much more epic and grand scale of a game, along with the fact that there is a lot more polish to everything. The music is great. The animation is great. The character development is great. And the plot is fantastic in that game as well, especially if you played the first one. And that's one of the main reasons people play Japanese RPGs is for great stories. And this is a game that certainly knocks that out of the park. Is it as good of a game as the original Lunar in terms of being an overall package that works in everything? No, but it's a far more ambitious game.
Yeah, for me, I found Earthbound to be a little too weird for my taste. I found myself loving Lunar 2 a whole lot on the PlayStation, so I have to go with that one.
Meanwhile, I have not played Lunar 2. My plan is to play Lunar 1 soon, but I'm going to still throw to Earthbound because I love quirky stuff. I love quirky Japanese games. And just playing through this one was so much just WTF moments that at least made me go, this is special on its own. And especially as I get towards some of the games like Super Mario RPG, I'm going to be saying a lot of the same things. But I like the more quirky, goofy games that shake all those trends. Because let's face it, games like Lunar, to me, have a lot of very similar themes and concepts where Earthbound was just so goofy and offbeat. Plus, when you start listening to how they sample way too many songs or how too many things sound very similar, I got to give some credit to that.
It's like steal from the Beatles, you get credit.
Hey, I'll give credit to it. Pulled it off.
I think that in every category, now this is interesting because, I think Lunar 2 has a slightly better soundtrack. I think it's got better graphics. The storyline is very cool, and it's something Dan kind of touched on, is how ambitious this game was, and it wasn't just let's pick up where these guys left off and let's just do more of the same. Maybe a bad guy comes back, and it's it had a really good twist in it. Earthbound is very unique. You can't mix it up with another game you play. There's nothing that's similar to Earthbound out there other than the other Earthbound games. I did think that the graphics on it were pretty cool and pretty cute, the way that they looked, but it didn't exactly look like 16-bit. It kind of looked like the NES version with slightly more colors. I mean, the music, the battles were really good. I would almost say that Lunar 2 is a better game in every single category, other than nostalgia for me. Earthbound, I had a lot of great memories playing. I remember the first time I saw it in the big giant box with the book with the scratch and sniff cards and stuff in it. And I hadn't played Lunar 2 until, well after the 16-bit era. So I don't have exactly I don't have a memory of being a kid playing it. I have memories of being an adult and playing it and thinking it was amazing. So I actually, I'm kind of shocked here, but I have to go with Lunar 2.
Yep. Just one quick note on that. You mentioned you think it's a superior game in every way. Earthbound is definitely a less aggravating game because Lunar 2 does have the high encounter rate and it has the enormous dungeons. And as a result, it's very easy to get pulled in for, an hour and a half going through one dungeon that in the remake takes 5 minutes. With that said, you can save anywhere.
Well, and meanwhile, in Earthbound, you can spend an hour and a half just trying to shuffle your inventory to get the one item you need to progress. So
that's true. No, honestly, you could almost do a coin flip, but I do like Lunar 2 better. I think it's a cooler game. I think it's awesome. So yeah, Lunar 2, holy crap. I thought, Dan, you'd be the only person, and I would be the only people that thought it would be a tie. But no. Awesome. Cool.
Yeah, I can't argue with the logic on it.
That might be kind of considered our first upset. Right? Where was Lunar 2?
12 seed.
The 12 seed just took out the 5th seed. Yeah, dang. All right. Okay, going up to the right side, we've got the number 2 seed and the number 15 seed. Final Fantasy 3 or Final Fantasy 6 versus Warsong or Langrisser.
So now we get interesting. So I'm going to start this off. Like, for me, Final Fantasy 6 is like the 3rd best game I've ever played. Especially for as good as the Final Fantasy series is as presentation, 6 really jumped the bar in terms of cutscenes, storyline, soundtrack, but even just sequences like the opera scene. And you actually see a lot of the nostalgia of it carry throughout other Final Fantasy titles, like whether it's appearances of Ultros or additional themes or enemies like Magitech armor. That's carried through in even recent entries like 14 and 15. So for me, I'm going to say 3, or Final Fantasy 3 all the way, just because that game stuck with me, and I think I've played that at least 5 years ago. And I can still remember so much of it. Plus, especially the second half of the game, you finally have the villain get one, where most games usually don't let the bad guy win at all.
So I'll go on a quick rant about these two. First I'll touch on Warsong. Warsong is a really neat game. It was one of the first strategy RPGs to be released in the U.S. It's Langrisser 1, as we're all familiar with. It's a lot of fun. It is a Fire Emblem knockoff. It's not the original type of game in that series, and it's a very fun game to play. With that said, of the Final Fantasy series, 6/3 is my favorite game in the series. It's the last game in the mainline series to have any sense of whimsy. And that's an important thing that was vacuumed out of the series, really starting with Final Fantasy VII, and continues to be lacking from this day as just like a husk of what was once something that was fantastic. I guess Final Fantasy IX had little elements of that. But with that said, I think Final Fantasy III is a mechanically good game. It plays well. It controls well. There's a big world. You have the airship, which is fun to fly around. And there's a lot of things I like about the game. It is not a favorite of mine overall as far as Japanese RPGs go, but it easily wins out over Warsong.
Meng, what are your thoughts?
Well, so far for me, my vote is actually for Final Fantasy III. It looked very beautiful for what it is. But all I can say is it's not one of my top games. I think Final Fantasy V kind of beats it for me. Only because that was the first one I actually beat. Then I went on to playing this one, not knowing that it was 6. So,
awesome.
So was a huge jump from 4. So it was like, wow, it's so different.
Yeah, I agree. Final Fantasy 3 is my pick as well. I think it's a superior game for sure in that matchup in particular, and basically everything you guys had mentioned already. It was a humongous undertaking, very, very pretty game, great soundtrack. It's got the victory over Warsong. All right, then we've got the PC Engine Super CD Far East of Eden 2, Manjimaru, versus Nintendo and Square's amalgam Super Mario RPG. I'll start off here. I think that Far East of Eden 2 is a fantastic game. I think it's a very traditional RPG set in a very non-traditional feudal Japan setting. It's got a lot of humor. It is not in American. It's not in English. It's only Japanese only right now. Hopefully someday we will have a translation for it. Me personally, I've never played all the way through Super Mario RPG. I have played it a few times. I thought it was really neat. The view and the graphics reminded me of Sonic 3D Blast. I thought it was a pretty cool game. I thought the soundtrack's all right. A little bit too much of Mallow and other weird characters that I'd never heard of, like frogs and stuff. So my honest pick is Far East of Eden 2, just because I've actually played it more. I think the soundtrack's out of this world. We got absolute wonderful Japanese voice actors to do all of the voice acting in the game. It's just awesome. The cutscenes are fantastic in it too, and I'm sure that's Far East of Eden 2's only vote. So I'm going to give it its vote.
So I've played through both games, and what I will mention about Far East of Eden 2, and this is an important thing you want to explain about the Tengai Makyo series, is that it's intentionally supposed to be humorous. Your characters are over the top. There's a great amount of sense of humor to this. I'm actually also going to vote for Far East of Eden 2. And the reason is the size of the game is huge. The game has great art. It has great characterization. I played through it, if we're going back probably 17 or 18 years ago, when there was only a GeoCities page that was in Japanese, because there's a portion where you have to enter Japanese text. And I remember at that time hanging around an IRC room with a couple of other people who were into PC Engine and TurboGrafx games, and they got me to this site that had the, I'm guessing it was hiragana or katakana. I think it was hiragana that I had to enter to get past a certain point, and I eventually completed the game. And it's a beautiful game. I wish I fully understood it. The cutscenes have a lot of character to them. I think Super Mario RPG is certainly a very, very well-made game, and it plays well. You have combos with your attacks, similar to Final Fantasy 3/6, and it's a template for the Paper Mario games that would come later. But
Yep.
if Far East of Eden had been released in North America, I don't think this would be a very long discussion, but I think it's going to be 2-2 here. So let's see what Mengen thinks.
I think you might be right about that, since my vote is for Super Mario RPG. And I, for one, would be happy if Square or Square Enix would jump back and make a Super Mario RPG 2. I mean, I had a lot of fun with this, because playing Super Mario, you'd be like, why is Bowser joining my group? He's like asking me for help. I was like, why is he in my party? And then it gets silly from there.
All right.
I am going to make this 2-2 officially, because for me, Super Mario RPG was the RPG that got me playing RPGs. Because it was not only like Mario, which got everybody into it, but it was accessible. This was a game that I could play. My sister played. Both my cousins played. And at one point, we had all of our saves on the same card. And what I liked about it was it took its own direction with the Mario franchise and carved its own niche out of everything. It didn't have to rely on all the same Mario tropes. It could just say, here's what you know about Mario. Now we're just going to run off in left field with it and do whatever the hell we want. And in doing that, I found it was a lot more memorable. Like, the bad guys are all crazy, weird, and fun. And I was going kind of down my list this morning of, like, do I even still remember bosses in many of these games? And this was the one I could name all 7 off without trying. So, you know, I haven't played Far East of Eden. It sounds like a great game. But
Amazing, man.
I can't be the only person who would say Super Mario RPG was the first RPG I ever picked up. I didn't understand what all the stupid numbers meant, and I didn't have to. I could look at a giant green arrow that said, this makes this number bigger. Sweet, let's put it on.
Who doesn't like fighting the Power Rangers in this game?
I mean, you had the Power Rangers, you had Final Fantasy kind of, I almost want to say crossover, except Helix wasn't actually in anything else.
Yeah.
But just weird, unique characters, all the goofy minigames, and while it does, like Dan said, set the originate the Mario and Luigi series, the Paper Mario series, this was just kind of a weird slam project for Square when you think about it. And that it's a lot better than it has any right to actually be. And for the record, as far as I know, the only reason we haven't seen Super Mario RPG 2 is I think the rights for Geno are all jacked up. So I'm going to say push Mario on this one.
All right, so we have a tie. So I put up a thread on the Gamehuggers Facebook page that just says, we have a tie, Super Mario RPG or Tengai Makyo 2, Far East of Eden. What's your vote? See if anybody contributes to that and breaks our tie for us. So if anybody can break the tie or wants to chat on our YouTube wall, please go for it. Tell us what game you'd rather have us pick, because
I am hearing you may want to check the chat because it might be shut off.
You're hearing the chat? What? I'm in the chat right now.
Okay.
I'm in the chat. I'm the only person talking in it. Maybe I'm missing something. That'd be sad if nobody else. Oh god. Oh god, there's somebody else in there.
That would be me.
Okay. Okay, we got a vote for Tengai Makyo. Tengai Makyo 2. So we'll let that go for a little bit. We'll go through the next two matchups here in the rest of the bracket. Then we'll come back and see what our tiebreaker's at. We've got a Sega CD game and a TurboGrafx CD game. It's Lunar the Silver Star versus Dragon Slayer. And I could start this one off. I'll comment about this. My pick is for Lunar. The first Lunar is such a great memory for me. It's such an awesome RPG. I love it a lot. I think it's a great game. It's one of the few that Working Designs brought to the U.S. and didn't completely destroy. While at the same time, I know that they had a hand in helping with Dragon Slayer and localizing the Falcom. They did not, Dan, or did they? I thought they did.
You think Dungeon Explorer 2?
Okay, Dungeon Explorer 2. Dragon Slayer was brought to the U.S. By Hudson Soft, and it's a Falcom classic RPG in the Legend of Heroes game series. It's a cool game. I love the graphics. I think it feels and plays like an Ys RPG, like a turn-based RPG. It's got a great soundtrack. It's got cool sprites. They're the same size that they were in like Ys Book 1 and 2. I like the look of it. The voice acting is really terrible in most parts. It's funny, and it's got some good character into it. But otherwise, it's a pretty run-of-the-mill RPG. I like it a lot. It was in my top list because I have good memories of it, and I can kind of blow through it pretty quickly now. It's got like this awesome like battle system where you can pretty much just turn on the turbo buttons, just hold the button down. It's a good way to grind. You're going back and forth. You don't even need to pay attention until your hit points hit like under 10, and then you got to like stop and heal. But yeah, Dragon Slayer is a fun game, but Lunar is a far, far superior game.
So just to comment a little bit on this, Dragon Slayer is the first game in the Legend of Heroes series, which is a subset of the Dragon Slayer series that Falcom makes. So games like Legacy of the Wizard are part of the same back-end part of the series, but the newer Trails of games and PSP Legend of Heroes games are also in the same series. So there's a lot of other connected games to this that have been released in the U.S. With that said, one other note, yes, the dub in this game is absolutely terrible. You mentioned that it plays like Ys. It looks like Ys. It doesn't really play like Ys. It uses
I meant that it looked like Ys.
The game's mechanics are Dragon Quest knockoff, and it goes beyond mechanics to a point where you have gels instead of slimes. I mean, to a point where they're actually copying enemies. So again, it's a fun, cute little game. It's reasonably well made. I don't think it's the best experience with a traditional Japanese RPG you can find in the TurboGrafx. I'd rather go with Cosmic Fantasy 2 if you're playing English games, not because it plays better, but because it has a better story and is better presented. But yeah, Lunar takes this easily.
All right, Meng?
Well, for me, my vote is actually for Lunar. It was like one of the games that I played, especially on the PlayStation, not on the Sega CD. But I do have fond memories of the PlayStation one, as it was one of the games that I saw that had voice acting in it. That was like for me, that was like wonderful. Other than that, the next one was Thousand Arms. So I'd rather go with Lunar on this one, since it brought me so much memories for Lunar 2.
And I'll pair it on that one. I'm going Lunar, just because while I do like the Legend of Heroes series, I've played a few entries in that, mainly Trails in the Sky, which I know far later. But Lunar came out with a book with a bunch of extras, at least for the PlayStation version. I know. But that for me kind of gives it a little bit of a nod. I always am a sucker for games that include extra things like making of video discs or soundtracks, etc.
Sorry, I'm just holding up the grid.
So Lunar wins, and the final one is Shining Force 2. Hold it up a little bit higher so we can see what the bottom game is.
Oh, what? Right, yep.
Lunar.
Final Fantasy 2. Okay.
Final Fantasy 2/4/
Shining Force 2 versus Final Fantasy 2. I liked Shining Force 2 a lot. It is one of the best games in that series. I think actually kind of preferred Shining Force CD on the Sega CD a little bit better, and it wasn't in my choices to pick. So my pick for this one is Final Fantasy 2. I think that's the pick for me.
Final Fantasy II is a basic but well-made, well-crafted JRPG. The version we got in the US is the Final Fantasy IV Easy type, which is a slightly simplified version of the version of 4, and a lot of people don't realize it's not exactly the same game. With that said, I also go with Final Fantasy 4/2. It's well-made. The mechanics are solid. The translation is horrible. And the other thing that's kind of worth noting is there's a lot of the cliches and tropes that we mentioned with Dragon Quest V, taking these ideas and going in the opposite direction because that's what people expected. So I think it's a very safe game that plays it safe and is simple yet fairly well crafted.
All right, I'm going to throw a dark horse on this one. I'm going to go Shining Force 2. Reason being, there wasn't many strategy RPGs on the Genesis, but the problem I have is Final Fantasy IV isn't as good as 6. And kind of in the later years, Square has really, in my eyes, hurt Final Fantasy IV because they've released things like Final Fantasy IV The After Years, meant to be like an epilogue of the game. Except it was obviously not good.
Really? It's not a good game? I actually thought it was pretty cool.
Everything I've seen with it, just not even worth my time. And I guess my issue with it is, while I did like the set pieces of 4, I didn't find that the whole story thread really carries across enough to keep me interested, other than the usual, I'm evil, but I'm good, but I don't know what I am. I'm confused. Here's this little girl. And it just kind of goes from there. So I'd rather kind of throw to the dark horse on this one, because while I haven't played Shining Force 2, I've already spouted everything I need to say for 6. That one's going to run off with that between the two anyway. So I want to give the Genesis a little love on this one.
All right. I think that is that, right? Did everybody...
No, Meg needs to...
Meg didn't go yet? Okay, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, for me, I really, really liked Final Fantasy II, but I haven't really played much of Shining Force 2. So my vote would have to be for Final Fantasy II, only because I like the fact, the whole dilemma between, hey, I'm evil, but now I'm good. Of course, I really hated the part where he has to level back up to the point where I had him when he was evil.
All right, Zach, you're going to have to be our tiebreaker. I see you in chat right now. Can you give me your pick for Far East of Eden 2 versus Super Mario RPG? Because we've actually got, both on Facebook and on our live chat, one vote for each game. So if anybody else, the next person to vote for either Far East of Eden 2 or Super Mario RPG, that's going to be the winner, because we've got, I think, 4 votes for each game.
Come on.
Yes, Shining in the Darkness was a great game too. I know it's not on our list. Sad day. Yeah, right, Meg. That's not how it works, bro.
I'm also a viewer.
Oh, who is this Emily Neg guy? Oh, I guess he's picking Mario RPG. All right, so let's just jump right into the next round. I know that we still have a tie to break here, but eventually in the next couple seconds, somebody hopefully will pick a winner for that. Far East of Eden 2 Mario RPG, I never thought that would even go into a tie. It's impressive. Let me check here real quick on Facebook just to see. Nope, still draw. We've got Chrono Trigger and Dragon Quest V in our semifinals. Man, I don't know. I picked Phantasy Star 2 over Dragon Quest V, so I'm kind of leaning towards Chrono Trigger still this way.
So I'm probably the only person who's played Dragon Quest V. I am going to go with Dragon Quest V over Chrono Trigger, and that is not any sort of a knock on Chrono Trigger so much as it is this. Dragon Quest V is an earlier game. It has a far more elaborate plot, and a lot of the reason you play an RPG is for the great story. Both of them have Yuji Horii designed scenarios and Akira Toriyama art. Chrono Trigger does look a little bit better. I think the music is equal between both games. But the story aspect of Dragon Quest V, along with the fact that it tried to do things differently and go against the expectations of Japanese RPGs, makes it my pick over Chrono Trigger.
All right. So we got 1 vote for Chrono, 1 vote for Dragon Quest V, and I have to announce, thanks to our good friend Zach Spears, we have a winner. And it's a fucking upset, man. Tengai Makio 2, Manjimaru has defeated Super Mario RPG in the first round. That's pretty awesome. And that is not just us. We tied. It went down to Facebook, on the votes on Facebook and the votes in the live chat. And Far East of Eden 2 has eliminated Super Mario RPG. How exciting. That's awesome. All right, Meng and Tony, you still got to give us your picks.
Well, officially now it's bloodbath time, so... for me, Chrono, just no doubt. While I do like Dragon Quest and while I do appreciate them, I tend to move towards like 8 or 7 and 8, kind of the later entries in the series and where they've been going with things in recent years than kind of previous years. And one of the reasons I like Chrono is I never felt like I had to overgrind like I do in a Dragon Quest. That's kind of not my style. So I'm going to go Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, for me, I have to go with Chrono Trigger as well. Its story really struck a chord with me, and I really liked it, especially trying to go after all the endings. It was a bit of a hassle, but hey, I only managed to get all of them but 1.
All right, so we've got Chrono Trigger 3, Dragon Quest V 1. Is that how we're going?
That
Well, it sounds like
so.
I'm sorry, Dan. Dragon Quest V made it this far, but unfortunately, Chrono Trigger is heading to the conference championships.
You say this as though this is unexpected.
Well, it's just the way that it all kind of paired up. If it had been, Dragon Quest V and say like Tengai Makio 2, you never know. All right, so next round we've got Phantasy Star 4 and Lunar 2, Eternal Blue. Genesis versus Sega CD. Anybody would like to start this one off?
Here's mine.
Sure, I'm going to go with Lunar 2 Eternal Blue. Lunar 2 Eternal Blue has a much better story. It has much better presentation with regards to cutscenes, with regards to beautiful sprite art, with regards to fantastic music. It has the benefit of being on a CD-based system. There are some irritations with Lunar 2, as I mentioned before, where there's a high encounter rate and battling, and I think Phantasy Star 4 has similar issues. It may be a little bit less tedious than Lunar 2 is in those regards, but the giant dungeons, the fantastic gameplay, and the amazing story, art, and music, and the fact that Lunar 2 is flat out the most ambitious 16-bit RPG because of the size, scope, and amount of money that was thrown into presenting this makes it the easy winner here.
Wow. All right. Who's next?
I mean, I have the game like right here, so you can easily tell that it's my vote. I mean, still holds a lot of memories. I actually be in this one, but not really this one, so I'll have to go and play that one as well.
Yeah, I think what this is basically telling me, Meng, is you need to play more Phantasy Star games.
I agree with that.
I tried Phantasy Star Online.
PSO is awesome, but it's an entirely different game.
It's not the same.
It's just not the same. All right, we got 2 picks for Lunar 2 already. Look, I love Lunar 2. I picked it over Earthbound. I think it's a better game than Earthbound overall. But Phantasy Star 4 is one of the finest RPGs on all of the 16-bit era. I think it's definitely the best Genesis RPG. And I love the cutscenes. I love the comic book style. I love the gameplay. I love the whole thing. It just ties the whole series it ties the whole series up. It's the best Phantasy Star game. Lunar 2 is not the best Lunar game.
No, but it's still better than the best Phantasy Star game.
I think Phantasy Star 4 is a better game overall, in my opinion.
I'm going with Phantasy Star 4 as well.
Oh, shit.
Because, yeah, like I said, bloodbath. Mainly because when I talked about JRPGs I wanted to play, Lunar 1 came up the most. I never heard a peep about Lunar 2, so I'd rather, I could see Lunar 1 going a little farther than Lunar 2 for this. And frankly, while we can argue cutscenes and soundtrack, you have to remember the Sega Genesis versus the Sega CD is, I mean, that's a bit of a gulf in terms of difference. So I want to see that Genesis game get a little more love.
It's like, put it on a crappy system. That way it gets an extra vote. Okay.
Oh, come on. You got to
Hey, Far East Satan 2. All I have to say is that.
You got to pick from Meng because he's not played Phantasy Star 4. So he's like, well, I haven't played the other game, so I'll pick the one that I played. It's like, come on. At least Tony's played them both. So I put up another. We'll vote on the live chat. See if anybody wants to vote on our Facebook wall as well. See if we can get a couple votes on there. We'll run that for like 5 minutes. Let's see. All right, I'll start another thread. Our next round, we'll just jump right into that, is Final Fantasy 3 versus Tengai Makyo 2. Anybody want to start that one off?
I'll take
this
one.
Go ahead.
So I'm still going to lean towards Final Fantasy VI only because that's the one that got a lot of the systems refined. You saw kind of how you could start doing things with 4, and 6 is the one where they said, here's all the options, here's 15 characters to play as, and they're all really different. Mix it up and go bonkers. And watching people play it, you often try to decide who's the best party, and you'll just hear almost anything under the sun. Plus, it's one of the few games where I decided to grind, having everyone learn Ultima just so I could cast it like 20 times in the final boss fight and just cheese the devil out of it.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of echo something Dan said in the earlier round. Had Far East of Eden 2, Manji Maro, come out in the U.S. With U.S. voice acting, with us being able to understand exactly what's going on in the entire storyline, it'd probably be one of the best experiences in my entire gaming life. But unfortunately, it didn't, and I was clueless through quite a bit of the game. I watched gameplay of it online. It is an awesome game, but Final Fantasy 3, I've had better experience playing it, and I think it's overall a better game.
Yeah, Final Fantasy 3 is a more advanced game. It's a game that has, I guess, more complicated gameplay mechanics. It is not as well presented of a game, but I'll give Final Fantasy 3 the edge here. Meng?
So far, I would like to give Final Fantasy 3 the edge here, only because I did really like this, and the graphics was phenomenal. But I was kind of like iffy on whether or not that 6 was better than 7, but I would have to agree. So my vote is for Final Fantasy 3.
You said that you liked Final Fantasy 6 better than Final Fantasy 7?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think Final Fantasy 3 or 6 or whatever you want to call it is a better game than the PlayStation's Final Fantasy games. Okay, and a little bit of an update. We have 1 vote for Lunar 2 and 1 vote for Phantasy Star 4. That helps. Thanks, guys.
The bloodbath.
Oh wait, hold on. Maybe we've got 4 comments. Let's see.
Battle Royale.
Oh, we've got 2. Okay, still 1 vote for Phantasy Star 4, 1 vote for Lunar 2. So we're still waiting for a tiebreaker. Thank you for everyone that is commenting along on the chat and in Facebook world. That brings us to our last of the second round matchups. It's Lunar, the Silver Star for the Sega CD versus Final Fantasy 2 or Final Fantasy 4 on the Super NES.
So I'm going to go with Lunar the Silver Star in this. Lunar the Silver Star is a excellently presented game. It has fantastic music, fantastic characters, and incredibly fun scenarios. The battle system is complicated. The size of the game is huge, and it has an amazing story, which is the thing that puts it over the top. Final Fantasy II is a nice game. It's fairly primitive for a 16-bit RPG. It has a good enough gameplay system, but the localization is poor. The story isn't as ambitious. The art isn't on par. The music isn't on par. Overall, Lunar takes this for me.
Well, that's the same for me as well. So, just like what you said with Lunar, it really had like an enticing story to grab hold of you. a little bit more than what Final Fantasy II had to offer. If I had played Shining Force 2, I would have picked that one, but I've only played Final Fantasy II, so my vote is for Lunar, the Silver Star story.
All right.
Likewise, I'll give my rep to Lunar.
Yeah. I will pick Final Fantasy II just to be contrarian, but it was Lunar anyway. But Phantasy Star 4 has defeated Lunar Eternal Blue 2-1 online and 2-2 within our own podcast here. So a Phantasy Star game is getting to the semifinals. Phantasy Star 4 and Lunar. So that takes us to our final four. It pits Chrono Trigger up against Phantasy Star 4 and Final Fantasy 3 versus Lunar Silver Star. I keep saying Silver Star Story. I know that is wrong, but Silver Star for Sega CD. So what are your guys' thoughts so far? Like, what are you like now that we're getting into the semifinals here? I know that we're hitting our 1 hour time, but we're going to go over a little bit today. What are your thoughts so far on how this has gone? Are there any surprises so far? Disappointments?
No, not really. I mean, it's about what I expected based on what people had played.
Yeah, I'll agree with Dan,
we
although I will pull one out for Mario RPG on this one.
I am definitely surprised. I would have thought Square Soft Games was going to make it up to the Final Four.
This isn't GameFAQs.com poll.
Yeah, I'm pretty proud of us.
Well, either way, like when you get polls like this, because all these games are good. That's the beauty of it. So now it's like
Lufia is not.
Oh, stop it. Oh, stop it. Lufia 2. Lufia is a fun game.
better than Sword of the Stars. Anyway, but at the very least, when you get something like this, no matter what, it's going to be tight. And that's the best thing you can ask for out of a bracket.
Yep.
Even if we're probably going to totally see Chrono in the finals.
So I had a few picks on my list that did not make the top 16, and that was Ultima the False Prophet on the Super Nintendo, as well as Dungeons and Dragons, Warriors of the Eternal Sun, and
Cosmic Fantasy 2?
You know, I wanted to say Cosmic Fantasy 2, but I didn't. I didn't put it on my top 10 or top 8. It is a great game. It's got awesome presentation. You would consider Cosmic Fantasy 2 to be a better game than Lufia, Dan?
Yes, Cosmic Fantasy 2 is a better game than Lufia because it has a great story. It has great character development, which is something that a lot of the other games on this list don't have, partly because of limitations to localization, the fact that it's a CD game. So yeah, Cosmic Fantasy 2, and I also think Cosmic Fantasy 2 is an overall better package than Dragon Slayer. That's not to say it plays better. That's to say, if you were to ask me what's the best traditional Japanese RPG in English on the TurboGrafx, I'd still say Cosmic Fantasy 2 is a better play and pickup than is Dragon Slayer, just because of the story and the presentation.
All right. The final four. Meng, are you ready?
Sure.
All right. Tony, you ready?
You know it.
All right. We got Chrono Trigger going up against Phantasy Star 4. It's the best that the Sega Genesis can offer against Square Enix's. No, sorry, I'm sorry. Shit. Just Square at this point.
Yep.
Square's Golden Goose, Chrono Trigger. The story, the time traveling story of Chrono Trigger.
So overall, I'm going to have to go with Dragon Quest V. I'm kidding. No, I mean, Chrono Trigger wins this pretty easily. You know, as I said before, I'm not the biggest fan of Phantasy Star 4 compared to some of the other games here. Chrono Trigger is obviously an extremely good game. It has a lot of things that other RPGs don't. It has great characters. It has beautiful art. It has fantastic music. It's not very grindy. The plot is a convoluted mess, and that's another rant entirely, which we'll save for the finals. But it's a much better game than Phantasy Star 4 is.
Chrono Trigger may be a mess, but it still proves that it is a very good game, even though it is a mess.
I'm holding up the brackets for everyone to see. I know that my handwriting is very sloppy, but we're here, right over here. Chrono Trigger and Phantasy Star down on the bottom over there for the Final Four. Right now we're talking about that. So I can't really go against Chrono Trigger either. I think Phantasy Star 4 is a very great game. Absolutely fantastic, awesome time. But Chrono Trigger is pretty tough to beat, especially in this. And I'm just thinking of just this, encounter. Like, I think Chrono Trigger against Lufia, I personally think it was closer than what Dan thinks, obviously. And I think Chrono Trigger versus Dragon Quest was a close one. Phantasy Star, it nudged past Lunar 2, in my opinion, but I don't think it's quite as good as Chrono Trigger is. So I'm going to lean towards Chrono Trigger as well.
Okay. So that brings us to the other conference final, which is Final Fantasy 3 against Lunar 1.
Yep, Final Fantasy 3 or 6 in Japan for the Super Nintendo versus Lunar Silver Star for the Sega CD.
So I'm going to go with Lunar the Silver Star for a few reasons, and I'm going to point out what it does better than Final Fantasy 6/3. And the first thing is it's obviously presented better. It is a CD game. The characters have a lot more development because it did have the benefit of there's a lot more space on a CD to write dialogue. As a result, your characters have attitude. Null, your flying little buddy, has wisecracks and always has smart things to say. Kyle is a womanizing jerk. All of the characters have a lot more personality. The story is absolutely fantastic and far better than the kind of convoluted mess of a plot that we see in Final Fantasy III. The music, CD quality, and fantastic. You have great art and cutscenes that are far better realized because of the full motion video scenes on the Sega CD. Overall, this is a slam dunk to me. Lunar 1 is a much better presented, much tighter package. Is it as late of a game, and is it a game that has as complex of battle? No. Outside of that, it's the better game.
I don't want to pick. I really
Well,
don't.
I'll start squaring off. I'm still going to go with Final Fantasy VI on this one. Like I said, from when I played it for the first time, that opera scene hit like a truck. There was not an instance of something like that really happening in even a 16-bit game at that time, where you started having...
Like Luna singing a song, and that song being played in full motion, not full motion video, but in an anime cutscene where you have a character singing in front of and that introduces you to them. Oh, it's been done far better and was done earlier, and by the very game you're arguing against. Your argument is invalid.
You're an invalid. All right, I have a pick.
Well, I'll throw one more argument against that. So for the 15 people who have a Sega CD and got to play that version.
Oh.
So one other thing, the Sega CD version of this game was the most popular third-party title for the platform in the United States, and in Japan it sold at close to a 1-to-1 ratio with the Mega CD, which admittedly didn't sell that well. How popular a game was has nothing to do with how good it is. And quite frankly, Final Fantasy VI is a good game, but it's not on par with Lunar.
Well, I'll have to agree with that, because mine will be for Lunar as well. As much as I like 3 and how good it looks, but I actually like Lunar a little bit more since characters are more memorable.
So Lunar is the best-selling third-party game on the Sega CD, which for the Super NES would have put it somewhere in the top 200 on sales for third-party games. But with that being said, like Dan said, it's not a popularity contest. It wasn't what game sold better. It's actually what game is better, in your opinion. And I do think Lunar is a very special game. I think Lunar is the type of game that us Turbo nerds wishes we would have gotten on the Turbo. It's like Cosmic Fantasy. It's a little bit like Ys, but it's like so much more polished. Ys is an entirely different game. I didn't mean that Lunar is more polished than Ys. I meant that Lunar is way more polished than any of Working Design's other work was on the Turbo. And I think Lunar is the better game. I think Final Fantasy 3 is really great, but I actually prefer Final Fantasy 4 over Final Fantasy 6. So I'm one of those weirdos.
I prefer 5.
Well, anyway, Lunar is my pick for Final Fantasy 3, or my pick versus Final Fantasy 3. So that puts us at 3-1 in favor of Lunar. 1 Silver Star.
Figures was a losing battle, but I'm going to still fight tooth and nail either way.
No, I don't know. Picking Final Fantasy 3 is not a if I had if I had made my pick before Dan talked, I don't know if I would have said Lunar. I might have said Final Fantasy 3 because I was like, I didn't want to pick. And now we're at the best of the Sega CD versus the best of the Super Nintendo. The finals, they're here. It's Chrono Trigger and Lunar Silver Star.
So I'm going to go with Lunar the Silver Star again, and it's for a lot of the same reasons we discussed before. The fact that it's a CD game gives it an advantage in terms of storytelling, gives it an advantage in terms of character development because there is so much more text, because there is live voices. The art in both games is absolutely fantastic, but because of the fact that you have cutscenes, it's better realized. The final thing, and I think the big thing about Lunar, is the quality of the story. The Sega CD version is better than the PlayStation remakes in terms of story, is better in terms of how well realized it is, and more importantly, it tells a great, consistent, easy to follow, non-convoluted story with lots of plot twists and all sorts of wonderful characters. Chrono Trigger has great characters, but the plot is kind of a mess. Part of this is by design, by the fact that you can pop into different time zones and not time zones, but time frames, and you can choose certain things that may add characters to your party or not add characters to your party, but it creates a slightly less consistent experience. And part of the reason people play Japanese RPGs is for the great stories. So while Chrono Trigger is a fantastic game, and I don't mean to take anything away from it, Lunar has an amazing story, it has better characters, it has better art because of the realization provided by the Sega CD, and because of the CD audio, it has better music. Lunar is my winner.
All right.
Who's next?
Who's going next?
I technically don't want to choose between Trigger or Lunar, but I'm more leaning towards Lunar than I am towards Chrono Trigger.
Tony, what are your thoughts?
So, once again, I'll be the contrarian of the group. I'm bringing this thing down. But I found Chrono Trigger to be just such a special game, and I've actually won 4 multiple endings, if for no other reason than nothing. Like, I think of an experience I had when I played Chrono Cross blind with a friend of mine. As we were playing, we were communicating back and forth.
Did you play it blind so you didn't have to see the horrible character art?
Looked better than Final Fantasy VIII, but...
Well, yeah,
that's saying something.
But
I actually
But one of my favorite things is when you start talking with a friend and going, oh, yeah, I picked up this character, I did this. Or like, I have this guy. What are you talking about? Are you on drugs? And it just turns into this, I did something different. Like having, even if it's just small little changes, having the ability to mess with a playthrough, change an ending even slightly, that's kind of where some of that started. And you see that in later games nowadays, like the Witcher series, the Deus Ex series, and other big names in role-playing games. So I at least want to give it its due in that regard.
You had games with multiple endings prior to that, though, and that was certainly common in RPGs as well.
I should say that was one of the more popular ones that at least started with that, because I can't think of other ones that came before it that actually had that. Now we get to that, but that might be a good topic for a different podcast for sure. So either way, I want to give my nod to Chrono Trigger, knowing that it's going to be 3-1 here.
Josh?
You don't know that, but okay. Here's the odd thing about Chrono Trigger. Like for me, most people, I mean, everyone I talk to in the RPG, 16-bit retro gaming, you know, the whole scene, the whole community is like, oh man, Chrono Trigger is just wonderful. It's just perfect game. It's so much fun. It has multiple endings. It's got really nice, beautiful animated sprites. I mean, the game is like, it's like a really polished, perfect Square RPG, and it really is. It's an excellent game. But when it came out, you know, I had moved on to the Turbo, and I had moved on to the Sega CD and the whole like 32-bit, the beginnings of the 32-bit era when Chrono Trigger came out. And yes, Chrono Trigger was amazing, and it was such a pretty game. And I have gotten to play it a lot. Not as much as everyone else. I'm not saying I'm Meng, where I have never played it. I have played it. I've recently started 2 different games on to try to get 2 different endings. But Lunar, to me, is such an epic game. It's just so wonderful, and it's just everything about it is like, man, the cutscenes, the storyline, the character development is. I'm like invested in the characters. Chrono Trigger, you definitely get invested in the characters, but like if I'm looking at this chart right here, like I've already voted against Chrono Trigger once with Phantasy Star 4. I think Final Fantasy 3 or Final Fantasy 6 is a better game than Chrono Trigger. I picked Lunar over Final Fantasy 3. I think Final Fantasy 2 is a more enjoyable game than Chrono Trigger. So it's like not exactly one of my top favorite games, but I understand how it got this far. I think that bridge between the bridge between Chrono Trigger and Lufia is not as big as Dan does. With that being all said, I have to pick Lunar, the Silver Star for the Sega CD, as the best game out of all these, just because, man, it's a better game than Chrono Trigger, and it's not that it's a massively better game. It is a very much different experience, but it gives you that like feeling of like you experience a movie, you experience the soundtrack. It's something you can take and listen to later. It's amazing. I mean, and during that time of the early '90s, early to mid '90s, playing a game that sounded and looked like that, it was just out of this world.
Well, I think the big thing about Lunar is that it works so well as a consistent package. There's no flaw with Lunar 1. Everything about it is done as well as you would possibly see for a game of that vintage at that time. Yes, as Japanese RPGs, continued on in the later part of the 16-bit era, you got more complicated battle systems. You got better cutscenes and whatnot. But for what it was, it did everything extremely well, and it's the game that swings for the fences and hits it out of the park, where Lunar 2 swings for the fences and it doesn't quite hit the ball dead up center. So yeah, no argument here.
All right, so if we go and look at our bracket, this is how it wound up going all the way through. Where Final Four was Chrono Trigger versus Phantasy Star 4, and Final Fantasy 3 versus Lunar. And it wound up being Lunar and Chrono Trigger in the finals, with Lunar edging out Chrono Trigger in what a lot of people would consider an upset, because our picks had Chrono Trigger as our number 1 seed, and Lunar, I believe, was our 4th seed. Because it went 1, 2, 3.
Lunar's number 3.
Number 3.
Oh, sorry. Lunar was 3 and Phantasy Star 4 was number 4. So
and I think the long story short is, no matter what, I mean, that's a good bracket, no matter which way you look at it. It's kind of you can't go wrong with any of those picks, except maybe Lufia. There you go, Dan. I gave you one.
Oh my God. It's not that. You guys are crazy.
Hey, I after how much bloodbath there was, I gotta start, olive trees here. But either way, all these are great games. So then when you start pairing up, the heavyweights against each other, it's going to get really entertaining. So I think, long story short, Lunar's been on my list for games I need to play for a long time.
Play the Sega CD one. Do not play the PlayStation one. Do not play the PSP
I want to,
one.
but I need to track. I have the PSP or PS1 version. I don't have a Sega CD. That's on my list. But
I've played many different ports of Lunar. So far, I have never played the Sega CD one.
The story in the Sega CD one is a little bit different. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but what happened was they had 2. Go ahead.
I played the GBA one, and it was kind of different than what I had remembered what it was supposed to be.
Oh yes, Lunar Legend is completely crazy.
Well, and then
I
you have
to stop.
Well, then you even have, if I remember right, Lunar was re-released on the PSP as Silver Star Story Complete.
No, it was Silver Star Harmony on PSP.
Or Silver Star Harmony. Thank you. And if I remember right, there was even more differences in that versus the other 3 there. So
yeah, basically there's 4 main versions of the game. There is the original game. There is the remake that was done for Saturn, PC, PlayStation, Saturn MPEG card. There's the Game Boy Advance one, and there's the PSP one. The one that is on iOS is the PlayStation version with the cutscenes ripped out and a crummy localization. So I guess we can throw that in with the other ones. But the original version of it has a different story, and there are some changes that George Lucas into the later versions of the game. It just created a few plot holes and made the story less interesting. So you definitely want to play the Sega CD game if you get the opportunity.
Yeah, I remember the GBA one being all right, though. Honestly, I kind of liked the larger sprites, especially in the battles. The battles and the larger sprites look cool.
It's not a bad game in and of itself. The problem with the GBA game is the localization is kind of poor. Again, tied to the limitations of having, cartridge for your speech bubbles. The battle system is weird. The game itself is shorter, and they made a lot more changes to the plot, to where you have, you have all sorts of odd things happening, and characters' motivations are completely different, and it's kind of strange.
I was like playing through it. I was like, I don't remember this in the PlayStation version. I remember getting.
Why
to
is
this
Nash
part
trying to be a
later.
Dragon Master?
I was like, what? But after I played it, I had to stop. I had to stop. Otherwise, that game was going to ruin Lunar for me.
The Dragon Song is the one that will do that.
Oh,
you never want to play Lunar Dragon Song. Just pretend it doesn't exist.
The DS one?
Yes. Pretend it doesn't exist.
It's pretty awful. It's sad. It's really sad. I was really excited about that. There was a number of DS games that were sequels to big games that we gotten in the past that were like coming out on the DS and was like, oh my god, this is gonna be so awesome. And almost every single time they were big time disappointments.
That was a game that was thrown together to be the first traditional JRPG out on the DS. I think it came out less than a year afterwards and was only in development for about 8 or 9 months. So.
Yeah.
But in any event, we're about 22 minutes over, so any last words for this week's Game Huggers?
I think everyone has either some homework or something that they learned from today's episode. So what I want to do is kind of go around and tell you guys what you've learned. So Tony, you have learned that Super Mario RPG just isn't all that great, right? I mean, honestly. And Meng, you've learned that you need to play a Phantasy Star game that is not PSO. I mean, obviously, you need to go back and play the Genesis Phantasy Star games. Phantasy Star 4 is a must-play. You got to play it. And Dan,
I was more of a Super Nintendo person, so
that's fine. So was I. That's why I'm experiencing all these amazing Genesis and Sega CD games now. It's kind of cool being able to experience them later on without the nostalgia factor, being able to actually play them for what they are. And Dan, you've learned that Lufia isn't that bad of a game, and maybe you'll go back and play that copy that you've got sitting on a shelf that you haven't touched in 23 years. You're going to go back and play it all the way through, and then come back on this podcast in 2 weeks and say, Joshua, you were right. That Lufia game probably should have taken out Chrono Trigger in the first round. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast this week. I'm Joshua for Dan, for Meng, and for Tony. You can always check us out at facebook.com/gamehuggers. Check me out on Twitter @_Joshua Turbo. Don't forget the underscore, as it is the most important underscore in all of the internet. Thank you guys so much for coming back for your midweek edition. And we hope you have the greatest of great last couple days of your work week to get to that weekend. So everybody, take it easy and make sure you wash your back in the wedding room. I don't know what that meant, but see you guys. Bye.